Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2013 Innovation Lecture here at the University of Tasmania. My name is Nick Cerniez. I'm the Executive Director of the Warren Centre, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here this evening, all educators, teachers, students, and of course our distinguished guests, Professor Peter Rathjen, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, and Dr. Alex Zielinski, the head of the DSTO and the Defence Chief Scientist, who is our lecturer tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Muwinina people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, and recognise that this has always been a place of teaching, learning and celebration. And celebration is the order of the day because, the bottom logo here indicates, the Warren Centre is 30 years old this year, and we're celebrating quite an anniversary as a result of that. The Warren Centre, I'm pleased to say, is here in Tasmania today. Unfortunately, we've never been here before, and it's somewhat of it's a desire of ours to expand our reach, and it's a great thing for us to be here. So thank you very much for welcoming us. I'd certainly like to thank the University of Tasmania for making us welcome. The Warren Centre, given that you probably don't know who we are, we're an industry-linked institute, a think tank. We're physically located at the University of Sydney, although we act at arm's length from that university, really. And we do a lot of our work in association with many universities. As a consequence, I'd be pleased to reach out and connect with Tasmania more than we have done in the past. It's a academically independent, non-profit social enterprise. We use our extensive networks in academia, government, industry to tackle big social problems. And the environment that we operate within today is increasingly complex, and the solutions to complex problems require collaborative effort, and that's really what the Warren Centre is about. So we're a safe, neutral place to do tackle big issues. Our meeting today, as I said, is indeed one of celebration, with the Warren Centre celebrating 30 years, but also this Innovation Lecture Series is 18 years old, and today we're here celebrating the achievements of a great innovator, Alex Zielinski, and that's part of the reason that the Warren Centre takes this lecture circuit around the countryside. We're trying to promote some of the great engineering stories that happen in our country and use that to help encourage others to take on technology careers and spruik innovation in some sense. Engineering, of course, it's the application of technology, science, maths, knowledge to solving problems. And really, we tonight have with us two exceptional technologists to speak to us. Initially, Professor Rathjen from the University of Tasmania, and of course Alex Zielinski. My job is to introduce Professor Rathjen, and then he can introduce Alex. But before we do that, a couple of quick items. Turn that on. If you could turn your phones to silent or vibrate, then that way we won't be disturbed. The sequence tonight, Alex will give his lecture, there'll be a Q&A session, and then following that session outside will be opportunity for drinks and refreshments. I'd encourage you to stay. There's a couple of exhibits out there that I'll tell you about in just a second. But before we do that, I'd just like to acknowledge our sponsors for this event. We couldn't put on an event like this without the support of our sponsors, of which the DSTO is the principal sponsor of this series, and our thanks go out to them. And the national partners, Roy Hill, a mining company from WA, the University of Sydney and Thales, who work closely with the DSTO, indeed. Our student enabler partner, CSIRO, for those of you, look down at your name badges that have CSIRO on them. Anyone who bought a student ticket, your discounted ticket price has been enabled by CSIRO, and their support is greatly acknowledged in that effort of trying to encourage younger members to come to this lecture tonight. State partners, Innovation Australia from the government, and Shelston IP, and our media partner, New Scientist, which I'll come to in just a second because there's a little bit of extra information about New Scientist. Regional partners, we've been to many cities around Australia telling them some great stories. Started with the Powerhouse in Sydney in July, and have been through many other cities, Adelaide, Canberra, Brisbane, Melbourne, Western Australia, and here we are in Hobart tonight. and we will wrap this series up in a couple of weeks' time in Wollongong. So it's been an extensive effort to tell a good story, and I hope you enjoy that tonight. At the end of tonight, before you leave, please pick up a brochure, a booklet, which contains the content of Alex's talk tonight. He's very graciously put those thoughts and the talk down into a commemorative, edition that you can take home with you and share with others. It also includes in it a few details of a couple of other items that I wanted to just touch on briefly at the back here. Vision 30 was an event, unfortunately for you, that was held a week ago, as it says there. It was an effort by the Warren Centre to try and look forward 30 years, given that we're celebrating 30 years. Best we look forward 30 years rather than backwards, and ask how can we create a future for Australia's industry for the future, for 30 years in the future, and what can we do about getting onto that trajectory. Part of that effort, it was a terrific day, and all the audio is up on podcasts on our website at the moment. If you wanted to find out about that, you can listen to the dialogue that happened on site, but the videos are not up yet, they'll be coming shortly. But one of the elements of this event, we decided not to just have the grey-haired industry leaders, the C-level leaders today talk, but we asked a collection of under 30-year-olds across Australia, in fact we opened it, it was open to all, to enter a competition, a national competition, and we had 7 finalists present their vision at the meeting. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because at the bottom of that list you'll see there one of the finalists is our Team Tasmania entry, and we happen to have James and Ruben here tonight with us in the crowd. James and Ruben, put your hands up just over here. At the end of tonight, when you go out to have a drink, you'll find around the room outside the posters that were presented by each of the 7 contestant parties at that competition. James and Ruben will be standing by theirs for part of the drink session. Please have a discussion with them. They're from Tasmania, from Launceston. They are from the Australian Maritime College, and their vision was all about Australia's future maritime industries and how that could really be part of Australia's future. So some terrific ideas and thoughts, and some very innovative concepts presented by that team, and I'd encourage you to have a chat with them outside over a drink at the end of tonight. Okay, just quickly, before I hand over to Professor Rathjen, also in the back there is information about New Scientist. By virtue of coming tonight, you can sign up to a little bit of their marketing, which is more, interesting than the general website stuff. You can get access to it through the details in the back of that booklet. Please do that. I'm going to introduce Peter to come up and introduce Alex, but before I do, given that tonight is a celebration, and really amongst this audience he probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but today is about celebrating innovators and technologists who have done great things, and I think it's worth telling you a little about Professor Rathjen also. As a biochemist, he has specialised in embryonic stem cell research, and his team has established an internationally recognised research program into stem cell biology and stem cell therapies. After undergraduate studies in Adelaide, in Australia, he went on to postgrad and continuing research in the UK, and then returned to Adelaide to take up a position at the University of Adelaide. His academic career has been a stellar one that's progressed extraordinarily through the chair of the Department of Biochemistry, and then onto the head of the new Department of Molecular Biosciences, and then the Foundation Executive Dean in the Faculty of Science at the University of Adelaide. After those appointments, he moved to Melbourne, where he was initially the Dean of Science and then the Deputy VC for Research, and 2.5 years ago was appointed here at Tasmania, University of Tasmania, to the Vice-Chancellor's role. He has, in addition to being the recipient of many awards and many accolades, has also supported a number of great causes. For example, he's a patron of the Science Teachers Association of Victoria, and importantly, one that I think is very closely aligned with the Warren Centre's objectives. He is on the board of the Tall Puppies campaign, which is about encouraging young people to take up careers in sciences and technologies, and to help create another generation of tall poppies. And in that sense, the Warren Centre's efforts to try and promote innovation and encourage others to take on technology careers is very well aligned. And for those reasons, I'm very excited to welcome Professor Rathjen to the podium. Before we do, well, when he comes up, before he can introduce Alex, I've got a small task for him. In this jar are the names of each of you, and there's a lucky door prize here tonight. One of you is going home with a 12-month subscription to New Scientist. The only rule of this contest is that the name drawn out of the hat, it can only be awarded to someone who is actually here, and we'll keep going until we find someone who's here. So dig in. And Sebastian Robin from the University of Tasmania. Do we have a Sebastian? Yes, we do. Well, you can come down, Sebastian. Congratulations. Very much. Professor.
Thanks, Nick, and can I just say that's my first go up being a barrel girl since I came down to Tasmania. I thought I handled it with aplomb. Can I say thank you for giving up your time tonight to be with us for what is a very important meeting. We're very pleased to have Alex Zielinski with us. He's someone who's very well known around Australia for very good reason. He's the speaker for the Warren Centre for Advanced Engineering Innovation lecture. It seems to be a week for firsts in conferences in Tasmania. I opened a conference 2 days ago at the Grand Chancellor, and it was the High Performance Liquid Chromatography Conference, which doesn't sound all that interesting to most of you. But what was interesting about it is the significant world meeting. It's been going for 40 years. This is the 40th meeting of that society. This is the very first time it's been in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's come to Hobart. It was a wonderful statement about the quality of the science that's down here, in this case particularly the chemistry. And then tonight we celebrate the fact that for the first time the Warren Lecture has come to Tasmania. We must be doing something right, and as I pointed out the other day, it is of course because we're special. We regard our relationship with the DSTO, which Alex now heads, as being very important to the University of Tasmania. We've announced partnerships, and this year alone we announced our new Centre for Food Innovation. It's a collaboration with DSTO and with CSIRO. It's there to foster innovation and excellence in research and industry engagement in technology transfer in Tasmania. It is based around Scottsdale and also around Launceston, with the university's main contribution being out of the Newnham campus. And it speaks to something else which is very important to us tonight too. Innovation is not only a global pursuit, although it is indeed just that. Innovation matters enormously to local economies and to providing opportunities for for communities which may be as distant as Scottsdale or Launceston from the major world centres. Innovation is relevant to the future of all of us. Centre for Food Innovation is an excellent illustration of the themes of what it is we're going to hear about tonight. It's a place that will link Tasmania, and in particular northern Tasmania, to national food research networks and to initiate joint research projects. Its aim is to diversify Tasmania's economic base by finding those opportunities for high quality exports, high value exports, which in turn are linked to highly paid, highly skilled jobs, which we need on this island to retain our children in the environment that we'd like them in, and to attract the best of what the world has. It will use science and technology to address real-world challenges and to exploit emerging opportunities. That partnership is real, and I notice Roger Stanley, who is jointly employed with DSTO, jointly funded by UTAS and DSTO, with us tonight. Welcome, Roger. It's not the only major interface between the university and DSTO. We have a major international asset in the Australian Maritime College. It, of course, does research into all things maritime, and DSTO has great interests in that space. We are very keen to find ways to exploit that space more effectively, and we're looking at partnerships with the Royal Australian Navy. For what it is worth, and you'll hear this from the university, Tasmania is criticised for being a mendicant when it comes to GST funding, but rarely do people point out that we get almost nothing of the national expenditure on defence on this island. And we see no reason why that should not be reversed. There are things that this island can do that take advantage of Australia's Defence Forces, and one of them, of course, is the training that we should be able to offer through the Australian Maritime College to the Royal Australian Navy. We're working together with a number of people to see how we might position that best. These things matter to the University of Tasmania because of the closeness of our relationship with the community itself. We're an active partner in the communities in which we live. We're doing these things because we want to contribute to economic well-being and economic resilience in Launceston and in the north of Tasmania. At the same time, we try to take this local focus and act at the same time as a bridge to the rest of the world, connecting Tasmania with the global community, the community of geographies, of cultures, of ideas. We try and bring that into our teaching and our research programs, understanding that innovation, often based on science, but not always based on science, is fundamental to human evolution and to the improvement of living standards worldwide in terms of environmental sustainability and economic prosperity. This university is strong in the space. We host the Australian Innovation Research Centre, which researches key issues in the areas of innovation, performance, economic development and public policy, and many of you will know about Jonathan West's leadership in that space. One of the AIRC's goals is to encourage entrepreneurial thinking through research, teaching and outreach programs, and as of next year we hope to make those programs much more widely available through the UTAS curriculum. My sense is that this island needs a dose of entrepreneurial activity, that students that we train need to understand that they can be masters of their own destiny and decide what it is that they're going to do with their life. And so next year we switch to offering breadth subjects across the university. One of those breadth subjects will be in innovation and entrepreneurship, and we hope that not just business students will study it, but also scientists and engineers and maybe lawyers and medical students and so on and so forth. We must be doing something right, because if you looked at that list of people who had been awarded the prizes by the Warren Centre, there were some from different states. There was one group from Tasmania, but there was only one group there that appeared to be a team. And one of the things that we do need to teach people is how to operate across disciplinary boundaries in the interests of better solutions. But it matters because of the key place that innovation must hold in Tasmania as we look at an economy that is in transition and which must find new, highly skilled opportunities for all of us. The university surely must play a role in this space. If innovation is going to occur, then in part it will be our research that provides that innovation, and to a very great extent it surely will be our graduates trained properly in innovation that create a broader innovation base than just the university alone. We must train them in terms of the research methodology, in terms of the entrepreneurial attitude that's required to reinvent the Tasmanian economy. I am accordingly of the view that this Innovation Lecture Series is a terrific initiative, and very pleased that I can introduce Alex here tonight. The theme of tonight's presentation, Think Big and Make It Happen, encapsulates what we should all be doing, and I'm very interested to hear what Dr. Zielinski has to say. So, to our speaker tonight, Alex is passionate about innovation and especially about inspiring others to great success. He was, as we've heard, one of the Warren Centre's Innovation Heroes in 2012 for his contribution to innovation in information and communications technology, and let me say he's been a great servant of Tasmania in helping to establish the ICT Centre for CSIRO down here. He's had a lifetime working in high technology, from academia through high-tech startups, big business and large institutional research organisations. I note that he worked for CSIRO and now works for DSTO, and that both are sponsors of tonight's lecture. He's clearly effective. Please join me in welcoming Alex Zielinski.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for those kind words, and it's great to be back in Hobart. When I was invited to give the Innovation Series lecture this year, I said to Nick, it's national, so why aren't we going to Hobart? And the Warren Centre was gracious enough to organise the schedule. And the reason I said why we were going to Hobart, because I've known from my work at CSIRO, at the innovation and the high technology that actually occurred here when I used to work at CSIRO, but also quite familiar with the university and the work that's gone on there. And certainly Jonathan West has been well known for his work and thought leadership in innovation. So, and it was very pleasing for me also that DSTO is actually partnering with the University of Tasmania in food innovation and also in the maritime space with the great facility, the world-class facility that you have in Launceston. So it was a no-brainer, literally, to ask for that to happen. And so thank you very much for everyone for coming along tonight. It's great to see such a good crowd, and thank you to the friends here who have come along. Nice to see some old friends here in the audience, and also some colleagues I know from DSTO have driven down from Scottsdale. So thank you very much for coming, taking the trip. So let's get started, and let me start off. Look, I thought I'd just give a very quick snapshot of my career, a bit of a timeline. But I did start off as a cadet engineer at BHP in the late 70s, and one of the great things about BHP is that you get to literally work on big projects. So I actually worked on big steel mill automation, and that actually got me interested in automation and robotics. Ended up doing a PhD at the University of Wollongong while teaching there, and that led me on to thinking about working overseas. Instead of going to the US or to the Europe, I decided at that time in the late 80s, early 90s to go to Japan. That was a sort of a place for high tech and advanced engineering. An obvious place to go for a person who was interested in robotics, automation, all those big things. But what was quite great for me personally in Japan, firstly I met my wife there, so it was personally very good from that sense. But actually what I learnt was a lot about the Asian culture of collaboration and teamwork. I really didn't realise how much my training and PhD training was all about me and myself and achieving great things, but actually the Japanese really do work very closely between industry and academia and come together in large teams. And it really was an eye-opener for me, and I really brought those lessons back to Australia, where I worked at the ANU, and we started some working with the Japanese, but also with Volvo and others, and that really got us started into an area that we thought could actually have great impact commercially, and that led me to starting a company called Seeing Machines, and I'll be talking a little bit about that tonight. And then subsequently, as Peter said, I went and worked at the CSIRO and got to work on some very big projects there, which was a lot of fun. And these days I'm at the DSTO, so I'm not going to take you through the whole sort of career, but I really sort of focus on the back end and the lessons out of the last 10 or so years, and drawn on those things. But when I look back on my career, I was only sort of thinking about this when I prepared for this lecture. I tended to sort of change my job every 5 to 7 years, and sort of worked on substantive things, I think, and without really thinking about it. So it reminded me of a quote my old boss Jeff Garrett used to say, is that technology walks on two legs. I think it's actually innovation that sort of walks on two legs. In other words, you've got to be mobile, and I think some of the ideas that I got from the way was actually moving around between institutions. But now that I work at DSTO and previously at CSIRO, I've always tried to encourage staff to have some mobility. Because in a big organisation or in a university, you can do many things. You can work on a big entity or big project and then take a sabbatical somewhere, and take some opportunities. And likewise in companies, we should be encouraging people to move back and forth, and that gives us an exchange of ideas. And I think that was one of the big things that there I think is an insight. And the other thing is, without really thinking about it, I always try to find the biggest problem I could find and try to solve it. But also I was always attracted to working with good people. That's the other element I would like to just leave you as a message. So let's get started with the lecture. So innovation is a word that's used a lot. And I've thought about, if you're going to give a lecture, you probably should define what innovation is. And for me, it's about turning ideas into successes. Success could be commercial success. It could be a social impact. You do something useful for the environment, or a personal health outcome. So it's kind of a success in a broader sense. But being a former teacher in the university, you've got to always come up with a definition. So here's my sort of I take on this, and I'll be using this idea throughout the talk. So one of the things we always want to do with innovation is to create things which is actually desirable. People want what you create. If they don't want it, it's not very useful generally, and it won't go very far. So there's got to be a pull factor in that sense. But being a technologist, we do get quite enamoured with trying to build something, make something, create some new breakthrough, and it can be quite enamoring that I've created this widget or something and it works and works well. But really, for it to be that feasible, in other words, the technology works under certain conditions, people need to want it. So you've got those two bits, the technology plus the people. But the other important point that I learned, and took me a while to get my head around all this, was that it has to be viable. In other words, business will actually put a business model around this and actually apply it. So got to have a feasible technology, people want it, and it's also viable. And if you look at these intersections, actually, there are certain types of innovation that goes on, because innovation is a broad idea. So the first innovation is the innovation that goes on between people and technology, that human interface. And a classic one is the knife and fork and spoon, the cutlery set, a great form of innovation in a sense when you think about it. Very simple idea, but feasible, but highly desirable. And that's an example, and you can think about computer interfaces that we use today, or a machine interface driving a motor vehicle, that sort of thing. That's what I'm talking about there. The other form of innovation that can go on is between technology and business. So this is more where a piece of technology makes business more profitable or drives its productivity. So the example here I would use is 3D printing. 3D printing, new technology, not necessarily big on the human-machine interface, but it's much more a business outcome, but it'll change business, that piece of technology. On the other side, you might say, what sort of innovation can go on between people and business? And I call this more of the emotive innovation and branding, marketing, such as the great Coca-Cola. It's nothing more than great innovation in terms of selling ideas or emotive branding. So that's a form of innovation there. So really what we're after, if you're really going to be that great innovator, is hitting that sweet spot. What is that sweet spot between where you get the innovation that hits all three areas, for the business, for the technology and the people? And that's things such as the iPod. Great technology, which everyone wanted, and then Steve Jobs put a business model around that with iTunes, where they clip the ticket every time you download a song. So, brilliant. Another probably example of that would be earlier, going back to the 1900s, the Model T Ford with Henry Ford creating that. And that's the sort of kind of metaphor I'm going to try to use tonight. I'm going to try to give you some examples of things that were successful, and we kind of ticked these three tests, and other areas where things didn't turn out as well as they should have or anticipated, and I think you can put it down to failing one of these tests. So let's start. One thing I want to point out is I think in Australia, innovation, we do have this expectation that it should succeed, and there's the famous examples of roll-on butter and things like that. But down there on the right-hand side, your right-hand side there is an innovator. Do you recognise who that is? Steve Jobs, that's right. Steve Jobs left Apple. He was sacked actually by the board, and he went off in the late 80s and started his own company, another company called Next. And Next actually failed and didn't succeed. He did also start Pixar, and they did very well. But when he came back to Apple, he brought the software and all the IP that he developed at Next, and that became the foundation for the iOS operating system used in the iPod and in the Macintosh. So he actually learnt from those failures. So I think one of the key messages here is that all innovators fail sometimes, and good innovators learn from their mistakes. Now, I think this is an observation I'd make about Australia. I think it's something we all should always be mindful, is that Australia has a very poor cultural tolerance for failure. Just look at our cricket team or our swimming teams. If something goes wrong, we quickly turn on them in that sense. And how can we expect our people to succeed, or particularly young people, that if you hire them in an organisation and don't give them permission to try to do something special, to reach for a difficult target, because it may not happen, may not succeed. Certainly in science and innovation, there's hardly a prize for coming second, coming second in a breakthrough. You really need to be first in science and innovation. So sometimes when we reach, we may fail. So I think one of the things I certainly encourage in DSTO, and I'm sure we do here in the University of Tasmania, is encouraging students to have a go. And it was great to see the young fellows having a go at the Vision 30 contest. And I think there was only 2 states competing, New South Wales and Tasmania. Was that right? Oh, they were the finalists. Okay, very good. So it's even better. So fantastic outcome. Okay, so let me move on a little bit quicker. A little bit about Seeing Machines. This is a company we started at the University of ANU, and it was basically industrial research. It was funded with some seed funding coming from Volvo. We had the spin-off company in 2000, around right at the peak of .com. And then 6 months later, it all came down, and we had to sort of get through that, and ultimately ended up listing on the London Stock Exchange, and now the company is doing very well as a world leader, and last financial year was profitable with $11 million of sales. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this company. But first of all, I really need to tell you about what the technology is. So the best way to do it is to show a video. And then you'll get a sense of what it does. So Seeing Machines, it's a computer visions. In other words, cameras are connected to a computer, computer processes the images and then makes decisions. So this is showing off the technology, and I'll just talk it through. So you can see those blue squares as features that the computer has extracted and is tracking, and is using that to estimate the 3D orientation of the face. Those red lines coming out of the eyes is actually the computer estimating where the person's looking. So this technology can actually determine what you're looking at while you're performing a task quite naturally. So where do we use it for? This is why Volvo was interested. It was putting into cars. And this is where we were using some experimental vehicle. And you can see a person driving the car. He's wearing glasses. And it could work with eyeglasses and even bright lighting. Very robust. So it was actually used initially. We wanted to actually use it for to try to understand what drivers were doing when they were performing the task of drive or operating any sort of machinery. And what we're trying to do here is once you understand how people drive the task, you can actually start to analyse this. So this is a computer simulation of a person driving a computer game, and you'll see over the display here, the red dot is actually showing where the eye gaze is, and the green square is actually showing where the nose is pointing to the face. So you can see that as a person drives, they look at the speed, they look at the corners, and afterwards you can then analyse what did they do when they were doing this experiment, and actually understand, without actually asking where do they look, you can actually know where they looked and do an analysis. And here you can see that they're looking at the road, missed time, speedometer, tachometer, rear vision mirror, etc. We then use this information with the Volvo to actually help them design their new generation cars. So if you've ever been in a Volvo, actually they're quite easy to do from the point of drive, in the sense to look at a side mirror or look at the instruments. It requires a minimal time to look at those. If the car is poorly designed, you tend to look for instruments longer, or trying to change the radio takes a longer period of time, or climate control. And that's the sort of thing we did. This is here just showing that you could actually analyse the performance of looking at live videos. So this was actually to show that you could, this guy's watching people playing soccer and looking at the ball. What was very interesting about this, you could now actually show commercials to people or a web page and understand what actually attracted the person's gaze, and be able to analyse that. So they're looking at the beer or the girl or whatever. So you can see that technology was done in 2003. 10 years ago, And since then it's actually moved on, but actually in terms it was more about the business models that went with the business, with the technology, and making it robust. So hopefully you get an understanding of what the technology did. So the key success factors in this company, it was world-leading technology. Too often, sometimes in universities and research institutes, people make claims about what it is, but we were able to show that the technology was actually superior and was protected by patents. Had a very well-balanced team of founders. And actually, one thing I should say tonight, you'll see some names appear on some of the bottom of the slides. These are the people I worked with. I literally worked with hundreds of people through my career, and they really are the tip of the iceberg in terms of how many people have assisted me in this innovation work that I'm talking about. So without their support, I wouldn't be having much to talk about tonight. We actually use the Stanford model for spin-offs. Too often in Australia, we actually try our own commercial models, which are commercially unproven and generally fail. We convinced the ANU at the time to use the Stanford model, which was actually using stock options, getting the university taking a minimal share in the company, and transferring the IP to the company, so that would actually get investors to invest. Having Volvo as a shareholder attracted others. We had a great, good leadership on the board and a CEO who were turned over every 3-4 years. I was the first CEO of the company, and actually Nick Cernius was the third. We're up to our 5th CEO now, and the company's doing quite well. We didn't actually use venture capital. We actually used high net worth individuals, and also made a lot of use of government schemes. Very interestingly, the federal state governments do have innovation schemes, but generally there's a change of government, they scrap the schemes and move on, without really always analysing what actually works. Some of these schemes were actually quite good. In 2000, the ACT government and the federal government had some effective schemes which the company was able to tap into and get moving. So it's really, there is a sense of government not having enough corporate memory in some of these things, and it can help. And some of these things were like a grant or a waiver of payroll tax. These are things which can make a difference to a small company. And we had a strategy for early revenue, strong focus on our customer and the product. And ultimately we listed on the London Stock Exchange, because Australia stock exchange is really for the resources industry and service company, not high technology. Even though we've tried to do that, generally our investors are risk averse. So we found we probably could have listed in the US, but we probably weren't big enough for the US, while the UK had bigger appetite for taking the risk. So let me talk about one of the successful products, the DSS, Driver Safety System. And essentially it's a camera looking at the face and with infrared illumination. So this system would allow any driver to just jump in the car and start driving, day or night. And the system automatically picks up all the features and then determines what they're doing. And what was the sort of the application we focused on, even though you could do many things, as you saw in the video, focused on inattention and distraction. In other words, eyes on road. Is the person not looking at the road, or are they falling asleep? And here's an example of what we're talking about here. So you can see he's looking away, and the system can see that the eyes are not on the road, so you can detect that. So we call that driver distraction. And I think the next little bit in the clip will show a little bit of micro sleeps with fatigue. And here we go. And this can be detected and a warning given. So this is we focused in on the very basic elements that would go into this system. When we started working with Volvo, they said we would like to see a system for about $150 a unit. Very hard to do when the components were several $1,000s a unit. We could have raised a lot of capital to build such a system, but in the end we decided to focus on aftermarket. So, and the mining industry. That vehicle at the bottom is costs about $2.5 million. So to put in a driver safety system into that, it's actually a low it doesn't have to cost $150. In fact, it costs quite a bit more. And we focused on aftermarket solutions, so we're using off-the-shelf systems. We got third-party endorsement. In other words, the health and safety inspectors at the mines were actually using this technology. And The outcome is it's the #1 product in the world, in the global market. Several thousand of these systems now in use, and now also being moved into other adjacent sectors such as the road transportation of dangerous goods. So if I look at that sort of people, technology, business, I give this product a green. It did all the things that we needed to do. It was desirable to the people who wanted to use it. We had a business model around it, and also the technology space. So I've got to say, each of these systems sells for over $15,000 each, yet there's only a few $1,000s of components in it. So it made the company profitable and has made the company grow. So, on the other hand, we did try to think, why don't we try to create a consumer product? And in fact, I'll talk about it in a moment, but you can see here there's a 3D display. So this is actually showing, because you can track the face and eyes, you can actually make the displays interactive. So you can see that the fellow here can see this display appearing as it track his face and appears accordingly. That is actually a two-dimensional display, but it looks like it's appearing in 3D. We were able to actually create a product based on this idea that it would actually work on desktop computers. We developed a licensing model, non-exclusive, and we created this Toshiba laptop with Toshiba, which actually is the world's first 3D free glasses laptop. So you've all been to 3D theatre and probably wore those glasses, and to see the 3D experience. With this technology, because we can track the face and eyes, we can actually give you the effect. Each image is being presented in real time to each eye. It actually looks like it's in 3 dimensions. I'll play this laptop for you. You can have a look at it after the lecture. It is quite extraordinary. So it's the world's first. Now, as a technologist, imagine how that felt to do that. But there's a but, and we didn't succeed. Because, I mean, I don't know how many people go to JB Hi-Fi and how many of the videos they sell are selling in 3D. It's usually a little corner, and people aren't really that interested in 3D. And the other aspect was the business model. The supply chains for laptops are very challenging. Each laptop manufacturer has their own suppliers. Even though we were dealing with Toshiba, Toshiba don't control the whole PC market. And also PCs or laptops have sort of peaked in demand, and it's the handhelds like the iPad that are going up. So in this one, I have to sort of give us a green on the technology. Technology was absolutely fantastic. People didn't really want it, and an amber on the business model. So that was a kind of a lesson that certainly the company learnt, and we look back on it. So that's how we started thinking about this more carefully when we did the mining machines example of DSS. Okay, let me move on. I've got to talk about. So at CSIRO, a great organisation, and I had a privilege of working there for 8 years, and I think some CSIRO colleagues are here tonight, so thanks for coming. So I picked out a couple of examples of what innovation did at CSIRO, where I was involved. One of the things that everyone has probably heard about was the Wi-Fi, the wireless chip technology, which is actually used in over 5 billion devices today. It was actually invented by CSIRO. And it was based on taking signal processing ideas that were used in astronomy in the 1980s and put into a hardware chip. And ultimately they started a project and realised you could use these fast Fourier transforms, which everyone thought would take a supercomputer, and they actually could do it in a microchip. And that got an insight into how to build a demonstrator. And they patented the idea, worked with startups. And of course, in the 2000s, there was an explosion of products, as I said. And ultimately, CSIRO had to defend its technology in the courts, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and has since received over $448 million in licence fees. And most of that money has been reinvested back into R&D, which is a great result. But there's many people there who actually contributed. Let me just quickly run through a couple of the success factors. Firstly, supporting basic research. Radio astronomy, when they were doing the work in radio astronomy and the signal processing algorithms that were developed there, no one really knew that you could actually use them for wireless communication. I think sometimes we start to think that we always have to work on applied research. basic research, if you do that work, it actually filters through. Again, this idea that was world-beating technology. At the time, IBM and a number of other companies were trying to build a wireless communications high-speed system. But CSIRO's technology, their ideas were the best ones. They had a really well-balanced team of inventors. The head of the team, John O'Sullivan, won the Prime Minister's Science Prize in 2009, and for leading the work. He was a great leader. But the team was multidisciplinary. He was a radio physicist, but he had a computer scientist, a mathematician, an electrical engineer, and a telecommunications computer systems person. And that team, working together, were able to crack all the problems that were required. The other important point is they really managed their IP very carefully. They had a great business manager who asked them to write up everything in their notebooks as they did the work. And those notebooks were actually signed off by John O'Sullivan at the end of the week to say, yeah, this looks like a great idea, you've showed me this idea, signed and dated. Very important when the court cases came that they actually could prove when the technology was done. Too often in places like CSIRO and universities, we rush off to publish the paper and then try to put a patent in afterwards, already disclose the ideas. So that was important. And what was really important was their well-thought-through business strategy. Right from the start, the team understood that this could be absolutely world-beating technology. Everyone would need wireless communications. They were thinking of this in the late 80s. And so they always offered the technology on a non-exclusive basis. There were a number of companies and big companies that came, knocked on the door and said, can you just sell it all to us? Just give us, and we'll give you $5 million or $10 million, whatever it was. And they said, no, we'll license it to you non-exclusively. They also had the foresight to understand that you had to get this technology into the standards organisation. So they worked with the IEEE to actually show them to the IEEE that this was a really good idea and the best way to do wireless, high-speed wireless communication. And with that, they also said that they would make the technology always available to anyone who wanted on a fair and equitable licensing regime. So it wouldn't try to skin, it would be available. They collaborated with the universities. Macquarie University, there was two professors there, Neil Westy and David Skellin. They were professors of electrical engineering. They were interested in this, and they decided they wanted to start a startup company called Radiata. Radiata built the very first chipset in the world that showed this high-speed wireless technology and was demonstrable. In 2001, Cisco bought their company for $498 million US dollars. So it's the highest sale for IP. So if you take the CRO royalties plus the trade sale of Radiata, it's over $1 billion returned. Interestingly, what people don't realise, Radiata had a non-exclusive license to CSIRO. So even after Cisco bought the company, they were paying us royalties on products that they were shipping to the world. So it was very well thought through. And we had commercial savvy business leaders who actually understood that we needed to take... it became very clear in the 2000s that it was our technology that was being used and is in the standards, and big IT companies were just using the technology and didn't want to pay CSIRO the royalties. So it was offered to them, and then ultimately litigation occurred. And this required the board and the CEO to be very brave. They had to risk tens of millions of dollars in legal fees to win. And they took the court cases and were able to, and the people who actually advised, and because generally boards and government organisations are quite risk averse, but they were able to do this and ultimately litigated twice and have subsequently won both times, all the court cases, and licensed the technology. So it's a great example of what can be done. So this is clearly, if you look at my test, people love wireless technology. It's a great technology, and you put a good business model around it and think it through, you can actually succeed. One of the privileges of working in a national science agency, be it CSIRO or DSTO, is that you get to advise government on certain things. And in other words, we don't tell government what to do, but if they want to have a policy, such as we can inform the policy. So the Rudd government decided that they wanted to build a national broadband network. Our job was not to tell them whether they needed a national broadband network or not, but actually to tell them what would be the best technology to use in such a network. And we did a big evaluation for them, and actually fibre to the premises was actually what we recommended. It did get a bit of criticism. This is very expensive, but we weren't asked to talk about the expense. This fibre to the premises is the future-proofing technology that'll last 50 years. You can bury glass in the ground, you can bury the electronics at each end, and it'll last. And, but the other really important point, big piece of infrastructure rolled out over a significant period, which gives a big opportunity for innovation. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that tonight. And, but also I'd like to just mention that, you know, while the criticism about the NBN has been that not the people who don't want broadband or the technology like fibre to the premises doesn't exist, it's proven, you know, it works. It's the business model. People say, what's the cost-benefit analysis of this? This seems to be too expensive for what you get. You know? That's been the kind of criticism that's been underlying it. Now, I thought, and it's a fair enough question, but I thought we should always look back on the lessons of history. And I think that the closest thing to broadband is really electricity. The electricity grid when it was rolled out. I don't know if people know, but in Australia, in the first city to get electricity was Tamworth in New South Wales, a country town. That was in 1888. And it was built, not the killer application, what they tried to roll out in Tamworth was street lighting. That's what the town centre built, a generator to, you know, steam-based, coal-based steam generator to generate electricity to light the streets. What people realised was, I'd love to have that in my home. And it progressively rolled out across Australia. In 1905, it came here to Hobart. That's when we had the electricity being brought onto homes. Now, at the time, in 1988, and then on to 1905 and onwards, no one really understood what electricity could actually do at the time. The singular important event, that electric stove, it's very interesting. If you look back in history when I was looking at this, David Curl Smith, who was a municipal engineer in Kalgoorlie, patented the electric stove in the configuration of a hot plate, grill and oven, which is really the configuration we have today. In 1906 he started building them with the municipal council. We built 50, got them put into the homes, and then the council said, maybe this isn't our core business. But anyway, I always say to Nick that he'd be a great, if we were doing the Warren Centre lecture back then, he would have been a great guy to invite along. But what was really interesting when I dug into this was that his wife, Helen Nora, wrote a cookbook with 161 recipes, Thermoelectrical Cooking Made Easy, published in 1907. It was the world's first electric stove cookbook. And that then obviously was the start of the revolution. Of course, we had radio, television, microwaves, electronics. The whole thing just took off. And I've got to say is that when you look at the history, there was absolutely no hint of that. There was no cost-benefit analysis which said you just give people electric lighting and you'll get all these other benefits. And I think broadband actually goes into that same category. Now, I've been around long enough that I started working, as you know, in the late 70s. I started doing university education in the IT sector and was certainly around when the internet was invented. And the internet was invented by defence to convect up computer networks for the defence system. And then the university said, well, we could actually use that technology to connect up ourselves and start to exchange information. And that's where it started. And I can tell you, in 1989, no one would imagine that where we are today. There wasn't that sort of cost-benefit analysis. Now, for me, the electric stove moment in the internet age is 2007, when the iPhone was introduced. And this is a phone which actually combines IP, the networks, which is broadband, and the telephone, actually converged. And it's basically revolutionised the way people start to interact with broadband. And I can tell you, in '89, we did not think that the phones would be what they are today, and when that moment happened in 2007. And that has actually generated enormous economic value. And looking forward, I think there's some enormous possibilities in other things such as e-health or distributed energy management using IT systems. I'm going to use one example of some work we did at CSIRO in smart farms to just give you a sense of this. But one of the things I just want to talk about innovation is what took me to CSIRO and to join there was I was very attracted to this concept of what they had, national research flagships. And these was a concept where the chief executive at the time, Jeff Garrett, said we should be trying to bring people together in multidisciplinary ways to attract or have the people, hundreds of researchers working on single challenges. He called them BHAGs, after the Jim Collins book, Big, Hairy, Audacious Goals. I thought it was a very interesting way of attacking a problem and bring people together to see if they could crack something challenging. And CSIRO today has got 11 flagships, and it's been quite successful. I just wanted to highlight a couple of examples from that time that I was there. And it has been successful in the sense that the flagships are not just a feasible piece of science, but it's actually got to be desirable. It's turning innovation to a success, either for a business or for society or for environmental outcomes, and actually putting a business model around it. So one of the first examples that we worked on, and I had input, or my teams had input to, was the Murray-Darling Basin assessment of, the Murray-Darling-based rivers. If you look at that, it's a fairly big catchment area, and what they tried to do was try to understand how much water was in the Murray-Darling Basin, because there was a big debate. Should we be letting these environmental flows or allowing irrigation to occur? And that's what, and there was a battle about, and of course there was an overlay of climate change occurring. We had a drought, and what was the right amount of water to provide to the uses by society, by farmers, and also supporting the environment. What was interesting was no one actually knew how much water we had in it. Now, CSIRO, working with its partners, were able to actually understand this and then inform the national debate. What's interesting is we forget that Australia is the size of a continent, and this was the largest study done, and they did a lot of fundamental good science to crack this problem. And ultimately, an agreement has been struck between the federal government, New South Wales, Victorian and South Australian governments about water usage, including giving sufficient water rights to the irrigators to farm, as well as also sustaining the environmental flows and taking into account climate change and climate variability. Extraordinary piece of work. One of the other things you might see in the supermarket is the Barley Max. It's a super grain. It's got twice the dietary fibre of regular grains, 4 times the resistant starch, and low GI. So these 3 facts means Barley Max is basically good for you. And it's actually available on the shelf. So great sort of breakthroughs of technology. The other one is the CSIRO Total Wellbeing Diet. It became the #1 best-selling book in Australia some years ago for a little while. It knocked off Harry Potter off the bestseller list, and again, what it was application of great science being turned into a way that people could understand it, in other words, so it was desirable to people, and a business model around it, working with a publisher such as Penguin to produce this. So 3 examples. Now, the CSIRO flagships, I talked about these BHAGs. I'll put one up here and I'll read it out. Light metals flagship. Light metals is that's aluminium, titanium, magnesium. And the goal of the flagship was to make Australia the world leader in sustainable light metals production and manufacture, to double revenue from light metals production in Australia and achieve growth in production and increase energy efficiency in production by 30%. Very specific. The only way you could get your program funded or get money from this program to do the research is if you could prove that you could contribute to this goal. Very challenging, because a lot of times researchers will say, well, yeah, I'm working in light metals, I'm doing something associated with that, I'm studying metallurgy or something like that, or you had to actually show how it would contribute specifically. And here's another one, the Food Futures flagship, also with another goal, quite specific. This was what was quite unique about these projects, and I think that's what really drove those sort of outcomes. So if you had a dietary book or a diet, you're going to work on a new diet, you had to show how you could actually turn it into a product, and ultimately they wrote a book or produce a new breakfast cereal, as I talked about. So here's an example of something we worked on. I was in the ICT area. I had a robotics background with our team. We thought that we'll work in the light metals factory on the hot metal carrier. And this was actually done for the Bell Bay Basin smelter here in Tasmania. And the idea was that this machine would work 24/7, pick up this hot metal ladle and deliver it to where it needed to in the smelter. So in other words, no people involved, and all worked by itself. It had to work safely with people around it. So there's a lot of technology that needed to go into this. New sensors. The system had to know where it was at all times and had to map its environment and be very robust and like literally work for hours on end. This is a bit of a sustained test here. So we got this working. It worked very, very well. However, the technology didn't get picked up. I don't know if people have noticed what's happened to aluminium smelting. The business has really gone backwards in that sense. Australia's high exchange rate, production, costs, etc., have not made light metals manufacture a viable sort of export competitive business for Australia. So we had to step away from that. So what happened was technology was good. People were so-so about automated stuff, but really the business model didn't work. So in the end, CSIRO actually adopted what I think is very important. We'll talk about it in the lecture material, fast-fail concept. This flagship cannot achieve its goals, so we'll stop it. And then the resources were given to other flagships, other projects. Too often in innovation and research, once you start something, it just goes on. Even though the economic conditions may not even be favourable, they'll improve, and you just keep going. But actually, in the sense when you've got limited budgets, the best thing you can do is when you realise you can't reach that stretch goal, better to stop and say, we stop, thank you very much, good work team, we'll do something else. Now, for us, the technology we developed in that was a mapping and localization technology. So in other words, this laser could be moved around and it could map any indoor environment or even outdoor environments. In fact, the team have used it to map the Jenolan Caves in New South Wales. Now this technology is being used to map infrastructure, in fact being used for the G20 conference that will be coming up next year. And what is it trying to do? So you literally walk around and map the area, and then maybe come back a day later and map it again. And you actually subtract the two maps. And then you can see if an object's been added or taken away. So very good for security when they're inspecting venues, etc. So this technology has been very well received, and in other words, people want it, there's customers, it was always viable, and now we've actually put a business model around it. And it's been successfully licensed to quite a number of companies, and there's been some startups associated with this as well. Now, one of the interesting things that we worked on in the Food Futures flagship was in agriculture, and here we tried to automate farms. We've always had robotics on farms, etc., but we were interested in other parts, this idea of sensor networks. And what you see up there looks like a heat map. In fact, it's not a heat map, it's a moisture map of the soil. So we had soil moisture sensors, and it told you where you had various moisture levels in the soil, so you could actually do precision watering. In other words, only water the parts of the paddock that needed to be watered. We were looking at this technology about 5-10 years ago when we started this work because of the droughts, because you really do need to not just put water everywhere, but where it's needed. And we also instrumented not only the soils, but also cattle, and put sensors on them. And the sensors we put on them were these sensor networks, and basically everything you needed to put in a computer could be found on this board. Radios, antennas, CPUs, and the interfaces to the sensors. Here it's being held in that you can see about the size of the fingers, you get a sense of what it was. This diagram shows all the functionality. This is from 5-6 years ago, this photograph. These days we can actually put the sensor on the whole system on the size of a 20-cent piece. And what is these sensor networks? Basically, they're self-organising networks. You deploy them, and then there's no infrastructure. They wake up and they start talking to each other and form links, and then they can start transmitting information, effectively relaying it through. But the systems are quite clever in the sense that nodes can be mobile, nodes can fail, and they reconfigure and reroute the data. So it's effectively, there's no setup. You just literally put the sensors in, and then away you go, and you can configure any application. That's the idea that we've been playing with. And where we also put these sensors was on the cattle here. So those big bulgy blue bits were actually the batteries. We had to sort of, because we're doing long experiments. Since that time, we've actually been looking at energy harvesting systems, which can actually charge these systems through the kinetic motion, very much like what you have in a watch. And what we could do is we had GPS on the cattle, so you knew where they were. You had a computer, but you could also give them a stimulus, very similar to an electric fence, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And this is an example of what we created, was a virtual fence, programming in the GPS so that the cattle would not go over the boundary, and you'll see this video playing. You might say, why would you do this? Well, in agriculture, 10 to 15% of agriculture cost is fencing. On the average farm, this is more than $150,000 in fencing. What you can do, though, with this technology, which we've shown, is that you can start to move the virtual fence. And then you can actually move the cattle anywhere. So, and we've actually shown this to use it to keep cattle out of sensitive areas in the Kosciuszko National Park. Those areas they didn't want cattle to go, and you could actually put that. So in other words, what actually happens here, as the cattle gets close to the line or the virtual fence, a buzzer goes. And very much similar, if they look at an electric fence, they see a red tape. They touch the tape, obviously they get buzzed. Here they hear the sound. If they keep moving in that direction, then they get buzzed. Obviously, this was, we had to work with animal ethicists and our livestock industries division on this. But an extraordinary way to change the productivity. So you could actually imagine that you could start to herd cattle with this technology, keep bulls apart. If a cattle is sick, you could have, measuring temperature on the cattle, you could bring the cattle to the vet. So quite transformational. And we've been looking at this in terms of being used with the NBN. It is a game changer because we've also done work with satellite technology and can actually can determine where the pastures are growing. So you can actually start to say, where should the cattle be? And I'll give you a sense of the size of livestock in Australia. Cattle herd in Australia last year was 28.5 million. Sheep flock was 73.1 million. Goat flock was 1.63 million. So we have more than 100 million animals under husbandry in this country. And if you imagine each one of these had such a system, each system submitting several hundred megabits of data, you have a big data problem or big data issues. In other words, you need an NBN. And this is an application. Now, this technology, I've got to say, is still amber. You know, the technology is still being developed. Farmers are a bit suspicious. Will it actually work? And there's the business model. However, we're talking about, I believe, in 5 to 10 years' time, such applications will be available and will be in use. So, let me talk a little bit about where I work today, the Defence Science and Technology Organisation. I was motivated to join the organisation because you get a chance to work on technologies for safeguarding Australia. Australians have been involved in the field in Afghanistan, and DSTO actually provides support to them, and actually in terms of blast protection, better equipment, better armour, etc. So actually making a difference to people who are actually deployed in theatre, as well as working at future technologies. The Defence White Paper is quite interesting in a sense it's got a whole new section on innovation and partnering that's possible for SMEs and universities. I really encourage people to have a look at the white paper. I know the new government has come in. They're basically saying they want to have another look at it, refresh it, but I know that they're fundamentally behind a lot of the ideas in that white paper. And one of the great things that I got excited about was the Jindalee Over the Horizon radar. And it's a project which has been around for a long time, and it took nearly 40 years to move from research to prototype through to concept and then transition to industry. But it's actually, we don't have any satellite technologies that overhead technologies can actually allow us to track. We don't have that. So to actually really protect Australia's northern borders, we actually require this type of technology, which it works by bouncing off the ionosphere radio waves in the FM frequency band, and you can see up to several kilometres away, and to the point you can see any very small vessels. And a great example of innovation. The asset itself is probably close to $2 billion in costs to build one of these such things, and the technology has been proven. The Air Force, very interestingly, in the first instance, couldn't see the value in it, but DSTO and the scientists kept plugging away and showed what can be done. So sometimes innovation can take a long time to get to the point where you can actually show success. And now there's a business model, and in fact Australia may be looking to export this technology to countries that are allies and friends. One of the other ones which I think is quite interesting here, and I think could have implications, it just shows what you can do, is that one of the challenges for Australia was when we deployed into Afghanistan is that the equipment and body armour that we had was all designed for conflict in Southeast Asia, in other words, the tropics. And here we were deploying people into the desert where temperatures were over 50 degrees, no ground cover, etc. So you really had to, it wasn't actually appropriate gear. Yet we had to deploy people. Normally when you deploy, the way things work in defence is that research is done for a couple of years, 2-3 years, then you might do a trial, and then you might transfer it to industry partner, and then there's a procurement phase, which could take another year. So basically it can take 7 years to move from a research idea to technology that's used by the Defence Force. We weren't going to wait 7 years. So what we were doing is every 6 months, what was occurred is people would, when they came back from theatre, looked at what failed, what worked. So people had problems with boots. The boots weren't any good. And we were able to start to innovate in terms of what sort of boots could be used. Also, we developed interesting things. We worked closely with universities and CSIRO to develop new ceramic armour, which is just very, very light. Previously it was very lead-based. And this was done with a small company called Australian Defence Apparel out of Bendigo. Australian Defence Apparel made uniforms. They decided they wanted to get into more high-tech, because clearly what's the future of making uniforms? That's not high-end manufacturing. They switched over to do this ceramic armour. And in Bendigo now they're making this technology and exporting it. So it's a great success example of collaboration, people coming together. And again, I give this one a big success in terms of technology, people and business. One of the great things about working at DST, you literally can work on rocket science. And hypersonics work is that where we've been looking at building hypersonic scramjets, in other words, air-breathing jets, which can move very quick, Mach 7, Mach 8. Just to give you an idea, that's 8,000 kilometres per hour, about 2.5 kilometres per second. So you could go from, say, Hobart to London in 2 to 3 hours. Fantastic. I don't know whether you want to ride in something like that, but it's possible. It's still probably be jet lagged when you arrived. And but we've been doing this research in collaboration with the US. Now, when I came into this program, I said, "Why are we doing this? Surely the Americans are doing this program." But I was told, no, Australia's actually thought of a way to do the program at a factor of 10 to 20 times cheaper, and we're doing making advances much quicker. And let me show you what our guys did. They literally took a rocket and fired it up with the scramjet into space. And it was sometimes, depending on what type of experiments would be done, this rocket would be shot up somewhere between 250 to 300 kilometres into space. And when it got there, it would be turned around and then brought back down. This is just showing two trajectories here in this video. And bringing it back down at the right angle, you would, somewhere between 20 and 30 kilometres above the Earth's surface, this projectile would be at Mach 7 or Mach 8, and then you would turn on the scramjets, etc., and do your experiments. And we had telemetry data from the ground capturing all the data about how these scramjets actually were operating. The way the Americans did this, they tried to build a scramjet vehicle which would try to take off from the ground with a lot of complicated boosters, try to get up to the right speed, and then they would try to turn on their scram. They had enormous difficulties with the actual vehicle itself and the whole system, and they weren't really testing what they really needed to do, which was the scramjet. So what we did was literally use projectiles, so launch it as high as you can, get it, turn it around and then bring it down. And where you want the vehicle to fly, that's where you do the testing and capture the data. Very simple and very effective. So we're able to do one of these experiments every 6 to 8 months. And so in 2015, March 2015, we're actually going to do the same thing. On the way down, we'll have a glider, and we're going to, as it comes out at the right height, it's going to fire up the scramjet and fly for 30 seconds. And we'll go about 80 kilometres in that time, and which is a great achievement. So that's what we've been doing. So very interesting work. But what's really interesting about this work, what I like about this work, is that it's actually a collaboration. It's not DSTO doing everything on its own. We just focus on what we're very good at, with some systems engineering and some certain parts of scramjet design. But we work very closely with the University of Queensland, with Boeing, with NASA, with the German Aerospace, and with the US Air Force Research Labs. Every party does something, and we bring our expertise together and have been able to do this. Now, the quality of this work is really outstanding. The International Congress of pardon me, Council of Aeronautical Science awarded Boeing, DSTO, University of Queensland and AFRL the Von Karman Award, which is the top aerospace science award in the world. And you'd never think that, would that be done in Australia? Yes, it is, but it's done through this collaborative model. And I think this is the way to go forward, and I think this is the way we should be working with the University of Tasmania and with others. So, now, people want this type of stuff, but the technology is still not ready, and we've got to put a business model around it. But I still think this is the way to go. And look, I want to just finish off tonight with a couple of big ideas for you to think about where we can go to work together. The future submarine for Australia, this is the thing that's going to replace the Collins-class submarine. $36 billion project for 12 submarines. It's bigger than the NBN as a project. All of the 2,300 scientists we have and technologists at DSTO, it's not enough for us to do this work. We need your help of business, small business, government and other research agencies. Cybersecurity is a real issue for Australia, and it's not just about protecting our secrets or stopping people from getting into your computers. Our infrastructure is dependent on it. Our electricity grids now and water is running on computers. Our electronic banking is 86% of our transactions are now electronics. In other words, cash is only 14%. So you can imagine what could happen if someone could disable electronic funds transfer. So this is again a society. It's not just a defence and national security challenge, it's a challenge for business and for society in general. I talked about big data. Everything is driven by big data. A lot of those data sets that we've talked about for the farming, that was just one example. The hypersonics is huge data sets. We have to actually look at how to manage that data, and there's business opportunities for business and government as well as research stuff. And the other important point I want to make is that traditionally defence has always worked in classified space, and then we've said to universities and small companies, you work in the unclassified space and conduct this work for us. What we're now prepared to say is that come inside and if you're prepared to get a security clearance, you can work with defence, and if you've got something that you can offer, we'll bring you in, and we want to harness the best national capacity to solve these challenging problems. Now, just to end up with some lessons, summary of lessons learned, I think one of the big things I think hopefully you might have picked up from tonight's talk is it's thinking of big things to do. But it's not just having a big vision, but it's also that the vision that you do, if you execute it, it'll have impact. In other words, make a difference. But to do that, you've got to always be focused on what you want to achieve and think about how you can, it's an achievable vision. And I think too often in research, we're not resourced for success. We just get a budget which is only about half of what we need or a third. It's always a problem to do this, but you've got to really look at that and be organised to make it happen. In other words, project management of big projects does matter. And the thing I talked about before, feasible, desirable, viable. And unwavering commitment to talent. I think one of the things is you think, well, we can just go and hire the best people. Well, guess what? Everyone else wants to hire the best people. Smart people are very mobile. They can go anywhere. So what we really need to do is in any organisation is to provide training, development and grow people. And this is where we need universities to be our partners in those training needs. And the other important point is all these projects I was showing you, that's all based on teamwork and collaboration. It's the days of single god scientists doing all this great work by themselves are really over. It's all about teams coming together in multidisciplinary ways. And the other important point is about living and breathing high performance. To do great things, to be the world's best, you really have to try to stretch for that. Well, you can say, well, you know, it's good to have a high-performing team, but you really need to recognise their performance and reward them, pay them a bit more, give them some movie tickets, whatever it is for kicking a goal one week that you want to get done. And lastly, I think the point I want to lead is leadership does matter. I don't think I've ever seen a poorly led research project succeed. Never seen that. Seen it go back the other way. So you really do need to have that leadership element. And let me finish tonight with Larson. So I think this is before we take some questions. So thank you very much for.
Okay, I think we've got a couple of microphones for people. We can take some questions with Alex before we retire for refreshments. Oops, I've jumped ahead. I'll come back to that one. If you could just give your name and affiliation, that way it'd be great. And let's go for the hands, and that way we're looking good. There's one up the back there. Alex, you better come back here, I think.
Get the ball rolling. My name's Jamie, come up from down south. Just in terms of innovation, particularly around defence, I'm curious as to whether anyone is putting their mind to the fact that if we had a peaceful world, we wouldn't have to spend billions upon billions of dollars on useless military crap, which is not doing us any good.
Yes, that's probably true. However, I might just point out the first computer that was actually ever invented was actually used to ballistics computation just in 1946. So defence funding created the first computer. Then we needed to understand where military assets were needed. GPS was created, launched with satellites, and ultimately the internet was also funded through military defence. Now, I think that computers, the internet and GPS are fabulous things that are being used by society today. Of course, I think I wouldn't disagree with you. But there are some other benefits, so I was going to say, that I think one of the things you find is military defence systems, they do drive technology. They're prepared to make those big investments for long periods of time, and then you get the spillover benefits into other sectors. But look, I take your point. No one wants conflict. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Harry Hobart from the Australian Maritime College and also in the Australian Navy. I just wanted more to know if there's a timeline for the future submarine project yet, or where it's at and stuff like that. Very interested in it.
Yeah, the future submarine project is sort of slated. It depends on what the life of type. The submarine was certainly built in the late 80s and start progressively being commissioned. So they say that we estimate that the Collins-class submarine will reach obsolescence in the mid-2020s. Maybe could be pushed out a few years if we look after them, so maybe 2030. So you really need to be thinking about what's going to replace it now, and because it takes at least 10 years to work out what needs to be done, and then you'd have to gear up Australian manufacturing or work with other suppliers. There is no real Bunnings for submarines. You have to actually, they're quite complicated pieces of technology. Each one of them, if you think about it, costs at least $3 billion. So you have to be very careful how you spend the money to make sure that they are built properly.
Yeah, Richard Doyle, I'm a guest of Mount Nelson Primary School. You mentioned the basic research that was done in terms of radio telescope work and how important that was. But you also spoke of, the economic imperative and the need for 30% advances in technology, otherwise you didn't get to be part of the program. So how do you get the balance between the two correct, the two types of research, very practical versus the fundamental?
Oh, okay. So look, this is I think you've got two types of organisations. I think that curiosity-led research, blue sky, where universities traditionally play, where you actually have people who can have a good idea and push it through. There is a sense that governments, etc., would like to see, or society would like to see an application of that. So people sometimes start to think about what could be applied more readily. But then you get organisations like my own or CSIRO, they're mission-driven. In other words, the mission says, let's solve a problem like working on, smart farming. And then you start to think about what research needs to be done there. Now, CSIRO has always done basic research if it's lined up with its mission. So we actually, with the radio astronomy, it's just that the government said we want to have support astronomy research. The best place to do is at CSIRO. So again, with instruments like that, you always got to be pushing the frontier. So we'd always be looking for new technologies, but then thinking about how to apply those technology into adjacent sectors.
Yes, Ian Shuey from Balloon Magic, an unusual...
What a great name.
Most of the entities you've spoken about to date rely on government funding.
Yes.
Very few, if not zero, members of our federal government have backgrounds in wealth creation in areas of science, engineering and technology, in comparison with other countries like China, etc. And my feeling is this is a great encumbrance to the future of our industrial capabilities in this country. Would you like to comment on that?
Look, I think that I actually think that sometimes the governments have got it right with the policies. I think what we've got is a little bit of a flip-flop system where there's invariably a change of government occurs in the state or federal, and invariably they feel like they need to change things. And too often things just change without truly understanding what was really working. So actually, if you look back at some of the innovation schemes that we've had for industry over the last 10, 15 years, some of them have been quite effective. I mean, in the dot-com era, the Howard government set up incubators. And in fact, here in Tasmania, there was one as well. I remember it was one of the better ones. And then there was this policy that, well, we'd only fund it for 3 years or 6 years, and then they have to be self-sufficient. But if you look at the Israeli example in Israel, even though the government supports incubators, they continue to provide some basic support because they understand the incubators then generate the startups become SMEs and grow on. And Israel's phenomenal in terms of its technology base. But we have this idea that funding should be, you've got to stop and start it and try another mechanism. Yet the mechanism was doing quite well, and the incubators that were left, who was free at the end of the 6 years, were doing quite well. So I think that's really my impression is let's just look at what succeeds. And I think too often we look for an Australian solution. Like I said in my example with Seeing Machines, Stanford, they've done so many startups. They don't try to encumber a lot of the work. They are quite happy to give away the intellectual property, but then they hope that philanthropy and research contracts from these companies will flow back. And proven, yet there's probably not many universities in Australia. I can't think of any. I haven't really talked to Peter Rathton about the University of Tasmania's commercialisation policies, whether they use the Stanford model or not, but most of them don't. They kind of cook their own model up, and they want to have university academics sitting on boards and things like that, which I think doesn't go well because they haven't got the background. So that's just, I think that it's not rocket science in this stuff. I think you can learn from others and then think about how to adapt.
Would you tolerate a layman's question? I know nothing about the science and the engineering you've been talking about, but I was struck by the fact that I think the only startup that you really mentioned in more than a passing phrase was Jobs. Steve Jobs.
Oh, yes.
Steve Jobs. And my impression from your presentation, for which, by the way, as a layman, I would thank you very much indeed, even I could understand it, is that perhaps more attention ought to be paid to startups. Now, one of the snags there is one that you mentioned, which is that Australians are not terribly good at tolerating failure. Question: how does one persuade the government of the day, now this one, to develop in this country something akin to the American Chapter 11 bankruptcy provision, under which people in America will fail, but nobody will hold them to account for that, and they will simply march on to do something else. Would that not be a useful thing to do in promoting startups? Can you persuade the government lawyers to do that?
Well, I think there's also, look, I think some of the, there's many factors associated. I think the Americans have a cultural difference, they're more risk-taking. Innovation is not just about startups. Innovation can be about any part of business or people coming up with an idea. So you don't necessarily, but startups is a form of innovation where you start with the embryonic technology and you start with something small and you want to make it big. And I think that Australia's, we don't have a lot of people. One of the things I realised when I was at CSIRO is that I was pretty lucky with seeing machines. You know, it was my only startup that I was personally started from. It was we had good advice and had some people helping us. And you've got to literally get the planets to align. So sometimes you go through this and think, oh, well, it's because I'm so good, I'm so smart. That's why we succeeded. But actually, it's actually quite a bit of. There's a bit of luck involved. You've got to be at the right place at the right time, of course, with the right technology and be pushing for the right things. So what we don't have in Australia is sufficient number of entrepreneurs who have been successful and unsuccessful and had that experience and are prepared to have a go. So when we've spun off companies from CSIRO, we struggle to find a CEO with experience to lead the startup who are prepared to take the risk. So the very small pool. So generally what happens is the young people, like my own son was interested in running his own company, had no idea how to do it. And sometimes they got into trouble because they had no idea how to do it and weren't prepared to listen to too much or didn't understand how business works. So it is, it's complicated. But I think that one of the important points is always to take good advice and know when to take and listen when you get that advice. So thanks for the question. It's a good one.
Hi, my name's Kieran. I'm an IT contractor here at the university. I'm here.
Oh,
I'm just interested in what you think about patent law and encouraging innovation, because compared to copyright law, it's only a short period. And you talk about Steve Jobs with Nextbase. I actually used that operating system, and it was the bee's knees, and it went nowhere. And then 10 years later, it's used everywhere, but his patents have all lapsed. But because it was software, it was copyrighted, so he can still make money on it. And I think maybe the patent law might need looking at.
Yeah, look, I think patent laws is it's a very fraught subject, you know, like a fraud area. It's the best of the bad. It's a bit like democracy, you know, it's a bad system until you can think of a better one, a better system. But I think that without having some way of protecting yourself, you really are. Otherwise, people unfortunately will take technology and they can steal it off the internet and just copy it. So I think without I agree that it sort of favours people with deep pockets and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, there's been many cases of, you know, patenting, and if you've actually done it well and done it right, like the CSIRO example I gave you, you can actually get the returns, and you've got to be prepared to contest and defend your patents. But I think that it's not something you wouldn't discourage. I don't know, for some reason Australia's got a very low patenting rate. Maybe it's because it's not measured, or people don't get returns for it, or it's not like a driver, or there's rewards given in that. But generally speaking, very low patenting rate.
My follow-up question here on that is, I'm thinking more about actually, you talk about non-exclusive patents.
Oh, yeah.
And extending the life of them, so in the biofield.
Yeah, look, I think that you could. I think that's non-exclusive is the licensing model, and I think people worry about sometimes locking up certain things which are obvious, you know, like you're patenting a gene or something like that, which is actually, well, is that really, it's a discovery, but is it actually an invention? And I think there's the application of that. So there are some areas, I think, which I'm not a patenting lawyer, etc. I've used patenting, and I encourage our scientists to look at that. But it's really just a way to say that you've got something. And also, potentially, the other important point why you should patent if you're in the technology game is to protect yourself from frivolous claims later on, to say that you're infringing on my patent and you owe me, you know, you can say, well, actually, we've got our own patent here, this has been granted, and that's proof that the technology is unique. Okay.
Right. Alex,
I'd like you all to join me in thanking Alex for an extraordinary, tremendous presentation tonight. Just before we close tonight, there's one little award that Alex, not a little award by any measure, he has picked up, he was awarded earlier this year, the Piercy Medal for the Distinguished Lifetime Achievement in the ICT industry. And for those of you who don't know what this is, in Australia this is the equivalent of the Olympic gold medal in this field. So Alex has joined a very distinguished list of people who have been awarded this medal, and there's the former minister presenting that, I guess, a couple of months ago now. But well done on that one. So it's a tremendous accolade, and it's consistent with, I guess, the series of innovations that we've heard tonight and the stories that we've heard. So congratulations, Alex, and let's all do that. Just to finish, thank you very much for coming tonight. Don't forget that outside on your way out you'll be handed your booklet, your brochure. Please join us for a refreshment and a bite to eat outside, and continue the conversation. And as I say, our Vision 30 finalists from Launceston are here. Please come and chat with them about their work, and take in the details of the others who are pinned up on the wall also. Thanks again, and I look forward for the Warren Centre to engage with you continuing onwards. So thank you very much. Good night.